Afternoon. Lovely to be here to talk about Thames swimming, although it does feel like I'm quite a long way from the Thames at the moment. I'm going to start by reading a very short extract from Downstream History Celebration of Swimming the River Thames, then talk about the stories of once famous women swimmers from the late 19th century. And this was a time when crowds literally of thousands gathered to watch teenage champions like Agnes Beckwith that Dave's just mentioned, Emily Parker and Annie Luca. And these were young women who were entering the very male arena of spectator sports to compete and also to earn a living in public. So the legacy and the impact of these women on future swimmers was hugely important, especially to record breakers of the early 1900s, 1910, 1920s. The women were very aware of who had come before them. But in modern times, with endurance swimmers now, most of these women have been forgotten. Obviously not perhaps in this room, and Dave and Keith both helped me a lot when I started researching this a few years ago. But even within the world of swimming, these women have their histories really have been wiped out. So what I was interested in is, what did these women achieve? Why aren't they household names today? And what on earth was it like to swim the River Thames in the 1870s? So let me read a very short extract from here, just to set the scene a little bit about what the book is about. I'm standing at the edge of a marshy meadow in Gloucestershire, cold water seeping into my Wellington boots. In front of me, under an ancient ash tree, is a squat monument that looks like a tombstone, inscribed with the words, "The Conservators of the River Thames, 1857 to 1974. This stone was placed here to mark the source of the River Thames." A wooden sign shows the direction of the Thames path, which follows the river for most of its length, while the sign below reads, "Thames Barrier, London, 184 miles. It's early February, and there have been flood warnings all along the path, following heavy snow, a thaw and general downpours. Normally, this spot is bone dry, but today I could almost swim in it. Beneath my boots is a clear pool of water with blades of grass and smooth pale stones. A handful of bubbles rise to the surface, and for a moment I wonder if there are fish in there. But this is water straight out of the Cotswolds earth, where a spring becomes a pool and then a stream. This is where, in theory, it all begins. This trickle of water that forms the longest river that is entirely in England, covering 215 miles from the heart of the countryside through its capital and out to the North Sea. The River Thames has existed in one form or another for millions of years. It's been written and sung about, painted and mapped, portrayed as a place both majestic and dangerous, refreshing and polluted. Its father or grandfather Thames, when noble or particularly chilly, is Mother Thames when tranquil and offering a watery embrace. People have drunk from it, washed and fished in it, and used it to dispose of every sort of waste. It's been a highway, a boundary and a food store, home to porpoises, whales, otters and sharks. An important trade and transport route since prehistoric times, it's carried passengers and goods from and to all over the world. We have rowed, sailed, canoed and punted along it. We've held regattas and aquatic carnivals, played water polo and skated over its frozen surface. But what of its swimmers? What of all those who have been drawn to its waters for enjoyment and to show off their skills? Swims daring and reckless, theatrical and highly symbolic. Before I started researching this book, I'd only ever swum once in the River Thames, some 40 years ago on a warm summer's evening near Taplow in Berkshire. I was 10 years old and staying with a school friend, and I remember laughing as we tried to swim against the current. I'd never considered its history as a place to swim, or stopped to wonder if my childhood splash made me part of a tradition. But it did, because this has been our bathing spot for centuries. This is the story of Thames swimming as I travel from source to sea, visiting places with long traditions of river swimming, delving into town and city archives, interviewing modern-day swimmers and looking for evidence, whether written, photographic or oral, of how we used to swim. I want to explore the character of the Thames and discover what it has meant and still means to the people who live by it and swim in it, to celebrate all those who have meandered along it and raced down it, who submerge themselves for pleasure or for charity, who perform spectacular dives from boats and bridges. What remains of how we once swam? What happened to the individuals and the clubs? Who has been documented and who has been forgotten? Now, as I've just said, the first time I swam in the River Thames was when I was 10. And until I started this book, I had no idea how swimming in the River Thames was once the norm. I'm not, you might have noticed by now, I'm not an academic or a trained historian, and so I approached this story more as a journalist or at times a novelist, keen to track people down who could tell me their own or their relatives' stories. Originally, when I started out, I was under the impression from what I'd read that women in Victorian times didn't really swim, let alone compete. But then I discovered that they did, and their choice of venue was often the River Thames, where they raced for miles in oil and sewage. It was the ideal place in many ways. I mean, it's a very long river. It's a challenge with tides and currents and lots of boats. It's great for spectators who could watch what was going on from the banks, the boats and the wharfs. And it was good for entertainment as well, with the press on hand and a brass band always ready to strike up music. The Thames was where men in Victorian times proved their manliness, and women proved not only that they could swim, but that they could successfully compete in what, as I said, had been a men-only sport. According to Australian open water swimmer Annette Kellerman, swimming is the best sport in the world for women. Here's Annette here. This is from an illustration from her 1918 autobiography, and it's full of demonstrations on how to do various things. And here Annette's demonstrating how to tread water. And each illustration, you can see she's got her stockings on, because women still, even Annette Kellerman, was supposed to have stockings on. And she's got an array of headgear that she showed, that she varies depending on what skill she's showing to us. In the summer of 1905, Annette Kellerman arrived in the UK from Australia to make her international debut in the River Thames. She had already broken records and was famous back home. She swam from Putney to Blackwall, covering 13 miles, and she later wrote that she would never forget the swim, partly because she swallowed pints of oil. Now, while Annette went on to become an international star and is credited with designing the first one-piece bathing costume for women, she wasn't the first woman or girl to swim the River Thames. And here, for example, is the woman who inspired Downstream. We've got Miss Agnes Beckwith on the left, Miss Emily Parker on the right. Both, unfortunately, look totally miserable. Let's hope that was just the Victorian convention of looking serious when you had your portrait. In September 1875, Agnes here dived from a boat at London Bridge and off she swam to Greenwich. She was just 14 years old. The 5-mile swim took her 1 hour 7 minutes, and she ended, said the press, almost as fresh as when she started. Now, when I first came across a reference to this swim, I was astounded, because I thought women didn't swim. What was this girl, what was this 14-year-old doing in 1875 Okay, the Thames had improved a lot, but it was still pretty filthy. And wearing a heavy Victorian bathing costume, which, as it got wet, would have really, really sunk you down in the water. You would have been swamped by all the boats. She'd swum further in the Thames than the great Captain Matthew Webb. So why had I never heard of her? Why had I heard of him, apart from the fact he swam the Channel, but I hadn't heard of her? And in fact, she would later top the bill when she was appearing with Webb. So I thought, with my sort of prejudice, she must have been a one-off. Agnes Beckwith, she must have been like some superstar, and she must have been the only one. But then I realised that she was meant to be racing against another 14-year-old, Emily Parker. In fact, because of the sort of competitiveness between her father and her uncle, Agnes did the swim on her own, and then Emily went and did one better. And they kept on going further and further along the Thames. Agnes completed numerous record-breaking swims in the Thames. Her 20-mile swim a few years later received huge press coverage. This time she swam from Westminster to Richmond and back to Mortlake, dressed in an amber suit and a jaunty little straw hat. We always had to know what Agnes was wearing when she was swimming. This is a later picture of Agnes, a signed, a sort of mass-produced signed postcard, which I think would be the 1880s. You can see she's wearing a satin costume, and of course she's got the compulsory stockings on. And but it gives you an idea of her fame, and it also shows you, you know, what a physically strong-looking woman she was. And in this day and age, we don't see images of women like the swimmers in Victorian times, who were well-built, strong women, built for battling the waves, some would say. Born in 1861, Agnes had been swimming and performing since she was a few years old. She later formed her own talented troupe of lady swimmers, and she travelled both home and abroad giving exhibitions. Soon she was being billed as the premier lady swimmer of the world. Her impact on the world of swimming was tremendous, but again, very few have heard of her today. And I'm indebted, as I said, to Dave and Keith for sharing their own knowledge about Agnes when I was writing the book. Now, the Victorian period was a heyday. I know that's a cliche, but it's true. It was a heyday not only for women swimmers, but for divers. And once again, these are men, by the way, once again, they chose the Thames to demonstrate their skills. Now, diving was a relatively new art form in Victorian England, and the country's first professional purpose-built diving stage, which is seen here at the Highgate Men's Pond on Hampstead Heath in North London, wasn't built until the 1890s. In the early 19th century, diving was more of a plunge, and the aim was to dive in and see how far you could go underwater. And then the Swedish and German gymnasts developed it into an art form until it was more about the process of getting yourself actually into the water. The Amateur Diving Association wasn't formed until 1901. Diving for men didn't become an Olympic sport till 1904. So can you imagine how amazing it must have been, years before this diving stage was built, to see women dive? And again, they chose the Thames. On the 27th of September 1889, the Graphic reported a lady's leap from London Bridge. It was none other than 17-year-old Marie Finney, already known for her aquatic performances in a glass tank. Of course, the act was an illegal one, noted the press, and arrangements for the performance were kept secret. It was not until 3 o'clock that the signal was given. After pausing for a few seconds to take her bearings, Marie dived from the bridge, striking the water beautifully and waving to her friends. The following spring, she wasn't so lucky. About to dive from O'Connell's Bridge in Dublin into the River Liffey, Marie was seized by a policeman and arrested. She was charged with obstructing the thoroughfare and find. This is Annie. Right. Another champion 17-year-old was Annie Lucker, or Lucker. I actually don't know how to pronounce her last name. In August 1892, she set off from Greenwich, intending to swim 18.5 miles down the Thames to establish claim to the female championship of the world. By London Bridge, the press reported, she was showing signs of tiring, but struggled on with the utmost gameness. However, after nearly 5 hours and having covered 16 miles with no refreshment at all, she was helped on to the accompanying boat. Here is Annie again from a newspaper clipping. Miss Annie Lucker about to take her dive. Now, while Annie started her career as a river swimmer, she went on to become a famous high diver. And one newspaper described her as the sort of girl one would expect to scream at a black beetle. Yet now, here she was, thrilling London on a nightly basis, diving 70 feet into a very shallow tank at the Royal Aquarium. When I wrote Downstream, my Thames book, I couldn't find out much about her, and I couldn't get any images that were good enough or could be cleared in terms of copyright to use in the book. But recently, 2 of her relatives have been in touch with me and have sent me bundles of press clippings and much more information that, you know, I wish I'd had when I'd written the book. But sometimes only by writing the book and getting it out there do people go, oh, guess what? That was my great-grandmother. So these are images that they've sent me. And this one I thought was quite a moving sort of picture, because we've seen Annie diving, but here it's a rather wistful image, the sort of image that you would find among perhaps family papers. Now, when it comes to 20th century swimmers in the Thames, one of my favourites is Lily Smith, who is not here, because these men are lined up ready for the most important swimming race ever held in England. This is Richmond, 1907. 33 people swam 15.5 miles from Richmond Lock to Blackfriars in what became an annual through London swimming contest. It drew swimmers from nearly every of the continental nations and continued unbroken until 1939. In the first year, John Arthur Jarvis won. I'm not entirely sure which one he is, and it hasn't been captured, but he was a painter and paper hanger in day-to-day life who had become English long-distance champion and Olympic swimmer. But again, what really interested me, and not apparently pictured here, is the one woman who took part in this race, and that was Lily Smith. And again, I was amazed and read the newspaper report over and over again, because I couldn't believe that men and women were swimming together at the same time against each other in the same place. I mean, if you think of, is there any sport that exists in modern times where men and women compete against each other? It looks like this happened for a couple of years, and then it must have been segregated, because the press reports would say the lady winner was number 1 and lady number 2, and then the men number 1 and number 2. So they must have segregated at some point, presumably because they're all worried that Lily Smith would probably beat them all. In 1908, she again took part in the Richmond race as a member of the Ladies' Perseverance Club. Overall, 57 people started the race and only 18 finished, of which, judging by names, 6 were women. In 1912, Lily here decided to swim the Channel, which was what a lot of Thames swimmers did. You know, once you'd conquered the Thames, you set your sights on getting across the Channel. But her stated aim was to demonstrate that woman is the physical equal of men. I am going to put a stop forever to all this twaddle about the weaker sex. Yes, I'm a firm believer in women's suffrage. While she didn't succeed with the Channel, you can see from this picture just how many medals she won. And there's a lot of images of young women around this time whose costumes are, you can barely see the cloth for all the medals that they're wearing, which again makes me think, so why have I never heard of her? And now it gets even worse, as it were, when we get to another 20th century champion to swim in the Thames, and that is Eileen Lee, pictured on the right here. In the summer of 1915, the 19-year-old swam from Richmond to Tower Bridge, and a few weeks later she repeated the course, only this time going upstream, which as far as I can see wasn't done again until the 1980s. Eileen left Tower Bridge a little before 9 a.m. and using the right arm overstroke swam 21 3/4 miles. There were loud cheers from soldiers on Tower Wharf, while at Westminster she received an ovation from convalescing soldiers at St Thomas's Hospital. Just before reaching Fulham Railway Bridge, she took a few tablets of chocolate, laughingly inquiring if it was lunchtime, and then ended her swim at Kew Bridge without much sign of fatigue. In June 1916, she then eclipsed all records made by men as to time, swimming 23.5 miles in 7 hours from Greenwich. It just goes on. Then on August the 19th, she topped that by showing wonderful endurance and swimming 36.25 miles non-stop in the River Thames from Teddington in 10 hours, 17 minutes. Her mother accompanied her, sitting in the stern of the boat in charge of the culinary department. At 25 miles, Eileen confessed to feeling a bit tired, but announced her determination to see it out. And by the end of the swim, Eileen Lee was long-distance lady champion of the world. But again, frustratingly, having come across little bits of reports and, putting it all together and thinking, what, 36 miles? Are you kidding? Non-stop. Then I couldn't find out much about her, particularly what happened after she'd become champion lady swimmer of the world. And then, out of the blue, I got, thank God for the internet, I got an email from one of her granddaughters in Canada. And she said to me that, their granny was an amazing woman whose feats boggled the mind. And they sent me a photograph of Eileen's swimming costume that she'd worn in 1916, which they kept, folded up nicely in one of their drawers. And it's not a good enough image to reproduce, but it's very sort of moth-eaten. But again, it's quite moving that the family has kept this, a costume that she wore 100 years ago. Now, in 1916, when Eileen Lee pulverised, and that was the word that the press used, when she pulverised previous records by swimming the 36 miles, the press, both at home and abroad, were well aware of the tradition that she built on. Eileen, they said, was a worthy successor of the pioneer mermaids such as Agnes Beckwith and Emily Parker. But again, we haven't heard of Eileen Lee today. A few years later, another champion took to the Thames because for her, the river was an ideal place and perhaps the only place to train for a channel swim. I mean, if you were an American, you probably had money and press sponsorship behind you. But if you were a British woman and you were trying to swim the channel, you really had to fit in training between earning a living and everything else that you had to do. So as with Eileen, again, it's thanks to family members that I found out more about this woman, Mercedes Gleitz, because I met her daughter, Doloranda, and she told me all about her mother's career. On 18th of July 1927, Mercedes left Westminster Bridge to swim 120 miles down the Thames and around Beachy Head to Folkestone. It was a journey that would take her 12 days and establish her as a trailblazing open water swimmer. No offence to David Walliams, but really this is where it started. This is a 12-day swim. So she swam for about 6 hours a day. Of course, you've got the tide, so you can't swim against the tide. Then she would get out and spend the night somewhere and then continue again. And yet, if you remember when David Walliams, no offence to what he did, but when he was asked, has anyone ever done this before, David? And he said no, but they've tried. And here she was in 1927 doing 120 miles, about 40 of which I would estimate were in the Thames. A few months later, after she'd finished the Thames swim, she finally crossed the Channel and was now the most amazing girl in England. And a little bit like Agnes, you can see that, you know, postcards were produced. I mean, she was a very attractive, you know, she very much fitted, the sort of image of what an attractive woman was. That didn't harm it. You know, that didn't harm the fact, not to take away from what she did, but she was very photogenic. And so that means that we have images of her that we might not have of the other women. Although, on the other hand, the fact that her background was German was definitely held against her. So, as in Victorian times, the 1920s was an important time for women swimmers. This picture shows the Surrey Ladies Swimming Club annual river swim. You can see, obviously, the women jumping, diving into the water. You can see the men in uniform standing on the barge. It's quite a cold day. The other women have got, you know, the men have got the overcoats on and the women have got the hats on. Now, as far as I can establish, this is the Thames' first swimming club for women. And it appears to have been founded as early as 1876, which is pretty early on in the history of organised swimming. Because in 1880, they gave a 6th annual entertainment and an indoor bath, where they gave displays of elegant and rapid swimming, competing for a writing desk, a toilet case, and a tea service. And, of course, they also swam in the Thames. Now, one of the club members, one of the Surrey club members, was a woman called Ivy Hawke. And at the age of 14, a bit like Agnes before her, she won the Thames race. And a few years later, she swam 11 miles from Ravensgate to Chiswick Church. 18 women started the race. Less than half of them managed to complete it. Ivy lived in Surbiton, where her mother ran the Spread Eagle Coffee Tavern. And she was nicknamed the Smiling Swimmer. Can you spot her? Actually, luckily, they're all, compared with old Agnes and Emily, they're all smiling. But this is Ivy up here. So she was nicknamed the Smiling Swimmer, and like the people that come before her, she'd done the Thames, now she wanted to cross the Channel. She failed on her first attempts, but in 1928 she became the 3rd British woman ever to swim across the Channel. Miss Ivy Hawke, 23-year-old London girl, conquers Channel, reported Pathé News, which filmed the last leg of her triumph. She can be seen ploughing through the swell using a steady front crawl, the accompanying rowing boat lurching from side to side. At times, if you ever watch this clip, the only part of her that's visible is her white hat. And at the end, she's surrounded by cheering supporters, clearly shattered, but still with her trademark smile. The press applauded her dogged endurance and the long, persistent, lonely fight against the shifting currents of the Channel. I shall be all right tomorrow, she asserted the day after her swim, and after that I shall continue to help my mother at home. What I find shocking and depressing is that in modern times women continue to set records in the Thames, but don't know about those that came before them. They may well have heard of Captain Webb, but what about Agnes Beckwith, Lily Smith, Eileen Lee, Mercedes Gleitz and Ivy Hawke? For example, Alison Streeter, the Queen of the Channel, who has swum the Channel more than anyone in history. In 1985, Alison swam the Thames. She swam from Richmond to Gravesend. The following year, she did it upstream from Gravesend to Richmond. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a very, very unusual direction to take. But Alison had no idea of any of these women. She didn't know what had been done in the Thames. She knew very little of what had been done in the Channel. And the same goes for Ness Knight. Now, in theory, we should all have heard of Ness Knight because in 2013, she set off on a unique round Britain triathlon, first swimming the length of the Thames, then running from Big Ben to Land's End, and finally cycling to John O'Groats. Her motivation, just like Agnes and some of the others before her, was to encourage more women to do it. Now, in the end, she was not allowed to swim through central London because the bylaw had been put in place the year before. It's illegal to swim through central London. But her 155-mile swim from Lechlade near the source to Putney Bridge set a new record. But unlike the champion women that came before her, there was no press covering this swim. Now, is it because David Walliam had done the Thames, he'd made it entertainment, we've watched it already? Is it a good thing because it means it's not that unusual for a woman to be doing this, so we don't all have to go crazy and go and watch her? But on the other hand, if she's the first woman to have done this, why was there absolutely no coverage? There are times when I think that in Victorian times, actually the press were more open-minded or even encouraging than they are now. Now, in the interest of research, I did, of course, have to go swim in the Thames myself. And this is a group of women swimmers, just happened to be all women, that I joined with the adventure company Swim Trek to swim 5 miles in the Upper Thames from Buscott Lock to Radcroft Bridge. Never have I been more exhausted in my entire life. I was hysterical with laughter at one point, you know, because you have to get in and out quite a lot, and then you had to have a wetsuit, and then you're supposed to be like putting sort of gel on your hand before you touch the wetsuit or you eat something, and I was just completely getting it the wrong way round. Plus I was very, very scared of swans, very, very scared. But during the swim, or by the end of the swim, I thought, you know, many times of the stories that this river, and look at it, the Thames is absolutely beautiful. If you enjoy swimming and you've never thought of swimming in the Thames, look, it's the cleanest in living memory. I mean, you can see the bottom, you can see the fish. It is absolutely beautiful place to swim. But it has so many stories to tell, especially when it comes to women. And although the book came out last year, so it's finished, I'm still getting readers getting in touch with me to tell me of yet more swims I'd never heard of. For example, this is Margaret White Rickson, and she sent me an email about her record-breaking swims in the Thames. Here she's being greased up beforehand. Now, I knew, and I put in the book, that in 1925 a man called Norman Durham had swum across the Thames estuary, where the Thames is more like the sea, it's salty and you've got tides and jellyfish, etc. I also knew that the only person who'd done that in modern times was a man called Peter Ray in 2003, and I'd interviewed him. So when I got this email from Margaret here telling me that actually when she was 17, she had become the first person to complete a Thames estuary two-way swim. So she'd swum from, let's say, I think she went from Southend to All Hallows and then back again. She did that in 1961. So why didn't I know about this? I was supposed to know about this. I've spent a few years researching this and interviewing people and doing the archives, and I've actually said in the book, Norman did this in whatever. The only person in modern times was this person. And why? Why didn't anyone in Southend tell me? I mean, I went to the archives, it's the amazing thing where something can just actually sort of be wiped out. So what she decided, this is her getting greased up to do the estuary swim, and then, of course, like a lot of other people, she decided, she was 16, not 17, she decided that she would swim the Channel. She did swim the Channel, and she became the youngest person ever to swim the Channel. So that's 2 records in 1 year. This is how the press, remember I said how supportive they are, not, this is how the press covered her swim. Come to think of it, why should a pretty girl want to swim the Channel? So she's just set this 2-way estuary swim. She's, 16 years old, and now she's going to do the Channel. Now, while Margaret's Thames swim was officially recognised at the time by the British Long Distance Swimming Association, it's not now documented. So there was some sort of documentation at the time. She's now sent it to me, but that didn't go anywhere from there. And so I felt that I was guilty of doing exactly the sort of thing that I'm banging on about, which is wiping out women record holders. But there is good news. Mercedes is now the subject of both a new documentary and an upcoming full-length feature film. Hilda James, who I haven't mentioned, but she was known, she's here on the far left with the stripy hat on. She was known as the English Comet in the early 1900s and is credited with introducing the front crawl to British swimmers, nicking it off the Americans, basically, the American style of front crawl. Now, Hilda is about to be inducted in a few months into the International Swimming Hall of Fame, of which, as you can imagine, there's very few women. So she's being recognised. And Margaret White-Rickson, that I just showed you, who did the estuary swim, she now has a Wikipedia entry, which may sound minor, but believe me, setting up a Wikipedia entry, I didn't do it, but I tried to help the person who did, is very, very difficult. And there's always the risk that someone is just going to take it down. But once you've got it there and you can start linking into that, she can say to people, I was the youngest to do this, and at this age and in this year I did this. And then that means when someone like me is going online to research, they will at least come across, you know, the beginning of a story. So this talk has been in honour of these women that have set all these, set all these records. And I'm certain that, that there are a lot of other people out there that they just need to have what they've done be recognised as well. And if I've enticed anyone to swim in the Thames, then my job is done.
Thank you, Kylie. Questions? Okay.
I'd like to think that 19th century elite female swimmers were positive role models. I can't
You don't
find
think
a great
they were?
deal of evidence to support that. Have you got any evidence that supports?
Who was it that was saying? Was it not you that was saying how Agnes, sort of showed young women, particularly like young working class women, that you could earn a living, that you could go out there, and that there must have been. I can't give you the evidence. No is the short answer. But what do you think? I think it's impossible for anyone to have seen Agnes doing this, for example, and dismissed it. I mean, she's doing something outdoors, she's doing something public, she's doing something that requires physical and mental stamina. She must have been a role model.
Your theme of frustration of not having the information at hand is a common thing for most historians. But it's interesting that Annie Luca, there's a fair bit of information about her earning potential.
Right.
But it just stops.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go any further.
Yeah.
And I just wondered whether you'd come across any information about these elite swimmers that would suggest that they were very much positive role models for younger girls, for instance.
I suppose I'm sort of fighting with you here because, you know, I hear what you're saying and I want to argue with you and say, yes, they were, but actually I can't give evidence for that apart from my sort of gut feeling, except that when you get the press talking about the sort of timeline, you know, when they say, here's so-and-so, she's going to swim this, and they start citing the women going backwards, that means that their heritage, there was a sort of line of heritage that got broken. Another way to answer, partly to try and answer the question, is that when I finish this, then I've written a novel, which is a fictionalised full life story of Agnes and a couple of other women that I've sort of, you know, put it together. And I think it's because I wanted to sort of answer questions like, what did the audience do, you know, when Marie Finney got up and dived into a shallow tank? What did the Thames feel like in 1875 when you're 14 years old and your dad's going, come on, I've got a lot of money writing on this. You know, to just get a feel, that's what's missing, isn't it, from the newspapers and for everything else. So I think, I mean, what do you think? She must have inspired people.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples of them going to seaside holiday resorts.
Yeah.
Because of the name, they gave swimming lessons. Private swimming lessons. So obviously they had a huge impact there. But I just wondered in terms of school boards and so on, would they have brought in talent like that to teach children how to swim?
Maybe that's later on. Maybe we're talking more early 1900s, where they would be brought in to present prizes at galas and, you know, as a sort of look at her, she's done this. Yeah, but yeah, it's a good question.
Just about Craig and clip it up. I know Leon C. and Southend very well. Very interesting. Although that's 61, I think that if somebody tried to do it now, the authorities would be right on them.
Well, they have, yeah.
Because the Kennedy, which is sunk in the middle of the estuary.
Right.
There was somebody who was on a canoe, or went up to it. I'm sorry, nobody knows about this ship. There's a World War II ammunition ship got sunk in the middle of the Thames estuary. It's still there. If it goes off, they reckon half of Southend will disappear. So Boris Johnson wanted to put a runway just there. It's a bit of a faux pas. But as time goes by, it's becoming, although it's slipping out of consciousness in Southend, one half of Southend, very wary of it. Somebody swimming over it with the retinue of boats.
Would read, yeah, and I didn't know that, and I can't remember anyone. I mean, they told me all sorts of, you know, mines that are going to explode and jellyfish are going to get you and this and this and this. Nobody mentioned that, and in fact, people do swim across the estuary, but nobody's done it officially. One man, a South African, did it maybe 2 years ago, and he hadn't got permission. So Peter Ray did it officially. Margaret also did it officially. But people now asking for permission, and they've gone to the Port of London Authority, which, you know, is in charge of all of that.
There's a massive container ship that's just been opened up there.
Yeah, it's a massive shipping channel, absolutely massive.
The guy posted something on his social media with him standing beside some parts of the wreck that stick out, and he was done prosecuted for it.
Wow. Well, what this guy did, the South African, is I think he crossed by train and he said to someone, can I leave my canoe here? I'm going back to Southend, I'm going to swim across tomorrow. And so she said, okay. So he did, and he couldn't find anyone to go with him except his long-suffering girlfriend, so she ended up as well. So I think she was in the boat and he swam across, and then on the way back, the PLA came out and said, we've got to escort you. Come with us, it'll be quicker if there's no arguing. And so they did that. But I have heard of a couple of other people not verified. That, of course, is a problem. If it's not done officially, you've got no timekeeping, you've got nothing.
That's one of the big problems. Is boats in the middle of estuary. If it goes off, it's a real big problem. They do say it's a problem from Southend.
Really? That's scary. Yeah.
One more, Ness Knight.
I wondered about the postcards. I do a lot of on postcards in the early 20th century, mainly looking for dancers. And say the postcard that was used for a visiting card. You know, you could have your photo and give it when you went on visit, or leave to the family if you went to war or whatever. But then there's the entire commercial side to it. And that was quite frequent, you know, actors, dancers, when they came to a new town, they would bring a lot of photo postcards and ask tobacconists and others to sell them, and then they would raise money. And I have a lot of postcards with people traveling the world, you know, somebody wanting to travel in the world, rolling a barrel in front of them. And the way they were to make money was to sell postcards of themselves as they went by.
Right.
So it was a way of, you know, raising money. What has struck me in Denmark is I haven't come across any sporting person doing it.
Right.
And maybe that's because in Denmark they were very strict on amateurism, but certainly this having postcards made was part of being a commercial brand, raising money.
Yeah.
So was it something they did to be able to train for it? I mean, you mentioned this, that, you know, they had to fit it in. Was it a way to become semi-professional, or was it just another?
Maybe others not. I would have thought with because, you know, with like Agnes, for example, was it her idea? Did she do the postcard? Was it her dad? I suspect it might have been her dad. Her dad was a showman. He was a professor of swimming. He knew how to put on benefits. He knew how to raise money. He was a betting man, you know. So I would have thought, you know, to get somebody's name out, make the pictures and circulate them. I think when you get into the sort of the 1920s, I don't think it was the postcards, the images were coming from them, you know, because then you started getting, obviously this is not my area and I'm just, as usual, opening my mouth and coming out whatever I can think of. But, you know, in the 1920s, that's when you really had the press going, if you can swim the channel, we'll give you this money. If you can wear the Rolex waterproof watch while you're swimming the channel, if you can eat chocolate and drink Bovril while you're swimming the channel, we'll sponsor you. So I think these signed sort of postcards probably weren't produced by her, Mercedes, for example. Do you know better, Dave?
No, I do know that like Agnes, for example, had card de visite, which you're talking about, visiting cards with a picture. No, the photographs that I've seen of glides, for example, signed photographs, tended to be, here's a photograph and I've signed it. It's not commercially produced in any kind of volume in order to raise cash.
And I don't think she would have. I mean, she was raising money, but I don't think she would have done that. I mean, because her daughter was saying that she never knew until after her mum died that her mum was even a swimmer. You know, she'd seen nothing, no evidence, and that doesn't suggest somebody who produced postcards, but someone who was quite sort of.
Just on postcards, like you used to get a lot of very localised production in that kind of time period, so you get obviously, especially with like photographers produced them as well. So
yeah, that's a good point.
For World Cup bands, they would produce them like every cup round, so it was really local. So that would actually be an indicator of like a local celebrity.
Right. Right. That's never thought about that. That's really interesting. Yeah, and just don't bid on eBay against me if I'm going up against.
Okay. Well, we've run out of time there.
Yes. Sorry.
We'll pick up, I'm sure, in the break. Thank you
very much.